The hearing will come to order, and we will be joined momentarily by Ranking Member Bass and some of the other members of the committee. But there are some votes that will be coming up on the floor, so we thought we'd start right at 2:30. Thank you and welcome to each and every one of you. According to estimates by the United Nations, more than 28 million people in East Africa today desperately need immediate food aid. 3 countries in the region face emergency level food aid needs: Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. Meanwhile, areas of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda also face crisis level hunger, with some households already in emergency conditions. In Somalia, at least 6.2 million people need food assistance, and that's more than half that country's population. In South Sudan, nearly 2/3 of the population requires assistance, and in fact, about 4.9 million South Sudanese, or about 40% of the population, face severe, life-threatening hunger, with that number expected to rise to 5.5 million by July. In Sudan, if you have to excuse me, I've had laryngitis for the last few days. In Sudan, more than 5.8 million Sudanese are believed to require assistance, 3.3 million of them in still embattled Darfur provinces. Unfortunately, the devastating impact of the current famine isn't confined to the hardest hit drought areas. Uganda itself, struggling with the effects of drought in some areas, has had to contend with nearly 800,000 refugees from South Sudan. By the beginning of this month, as many as 3,000 South Sudanese a week crossed the border into Uganda. Lest we get caught up in the huge numbers involved in this crisis, we must always keep in mind what those numbers actually mean for the people in the long term, as well as the immediate and short term. According to the UN Food Program, World Food Program, calculations in January, global acute malnutrition rates for Somali children and pregnant and lactating women entering Ethiopia reached a whopping 78%. That means that Somali children in the womb won't have enough nourishment to complete their growth in utero. Most, if not all, will be born stunted, which will be made worse by their continuing lack of nutrition once born. Their mothers will be severely weakened. They may not survive childbirth. All of them will have damaged immune systems and will be susceptible to diseases such as cholera or acute diarrhea and may die a preventable death. In any event, the futures of far too many children and their potential contributions to their society will be forever limited, as stunting cannot be reversed. In 2011, the first UN declared drought since the 1980s occurred in East Africa, directly affecting more than 10 million people. This subcommittee held a hearing on the crisis on September 28th of that year and worked with humanitarian groups to ensure that aid was available and provided in the most in-need areas of East Africa. We will follow this hearing with a similar effort. 6 years ago, there was great attention given to the famine then. It was an emergency that caught the world's attention. Somehow, the current famine has been caught up in the numerous global crises we face today and is not as much in the news as it ought to have been, and it is one of the largest crises we faced in recent years. In 2011, we struggled with how to get humanitarian aid to those in Somalia who lived in areas controlled by al-Shabaab. That problem has not been eliminated 6 years later. In 2017, not only is the ongoing conflict in Somalia hampering humanitarian efforts there, but the continuing civil conflict in South Sudan has amplified the impact of the drought. In 2015, a congressional staff delegation visited the equatorial provinces of that country, which still produced food, even though poor transportation prevented it from being distributed beyond the borders of that region. There was no conflict there at the time, only internally displaced people. Now all 3 Ecuadorian provinces are seeing a spreading conflict, and with farmers unable to plant or to harvest, the lack of food will only worsen over time. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has accused South Sudan's government of ignoring the plight of its own citizens struggling through the famine. He accused that government's leadership of a refusal to even acknowledge the crisis or fulfill its responsibilities to end it. In a time in which access to food is so critical in South Sudan, militias in that country, supported by both the government and the rebels, have been accused of intentionally destroying crops, looting cattle, and damaging vital water supplies. In July of last year, it is believed that government soldiers were responsible for looting 1.5 million metric tons of food from the World Food Programme's warehouse in the capital city of Juba. Matter of fact, Greg Simpkins and I traveled to South Sudan last August. We went to Juba and we raised all of these issues, starting with Salva Kiir, to the defense minister, to the head of the UN mission, and many others, including Catholic bishops and others, trying to underscore our concern about food insecurity, the violence that was escalating, because we were in a place where just about a month before that, about 200 soldiers had killed each other from two warring factions inside, right at the presidential palace. It was absurd, and we did raise the concerns of our colleagues, our speaker, and the president, but not much has happened in response, sadly. The conflicts in Somalia and South Sudan affect the entire region and place added burdens on their neighbors, who must also cope with the recurring drought. These two countries, along with Eritrea, remain the largest source of refugees globally. We cannot control the weather patterns that lead to recurring droughts in East Africa, but we must find a way to end the conflicts in those two nations so that man-made disasters don't outstrip the impact of nature itself. I'll never forget how the famine in Ethiopia during the Mengistu regime was made all the worse because he used food as a weapon. We can't see a replay of that atrocity today. The term famine, like the term genocide, should not be used lightly. To be considered a famine, there must be an extreme lack of food in at least 20% of the households in any area. Acute malnourishment must affect 30% of children, and a crude death rate of more than 2 deaths per 10,000 must exist daily in the affected areas. As our witness will describe for us today, the situation is already or soon will be in the state of famine in areas of East Africa. Our mission today is to better understand the parameters of the crisis, its causative factors, and the most effective action that must be taken now to save lives and end the threat of an even greater casualty count. So I want to thank again our witness and then begin the witness testimony with Mr. Matthew Nims, who has more than 17 years of international development and emergency programming experience. He has been with USAID since the year 2000 and has worked in Indonesia, Ghana, Afghanistan, and here in Washington. Starting in August of 2011, he began serving as the Deputy Director of the Office for Food for Peace, and since January 2017, has been the Acting Director of the Office with a $2 billion a year budget. Food for Peace is the U.S. government's lead for addressing food insecurity worldwide in both emergency and development situations. Mr. Nims, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, esteemed staff, thank you for the invitation to come speak with you today about the food security situation in East Africa, especially the threat of famine in Somalia. Thank you for drawing attention to the plight of the world's vulnerable people and your long history of support for humanitarian efforts. This year, massive humanitarian crises are occurring around the world, demanding an immediate, substantial, and creative response. Our famine early warning system, FuseNet, warns that an unprecedented 70 million people will need emergency food assistance this year due to ongoing conflict, severe drought, and economic instability. These crises are largely man-made, with other compounding factors like the drought in Somalia, making the situation even more untenable. East Africa is facing one of the worst droughts ever recorded, and as many as 15 million people in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are facing food and water shortages as a result. In many areas, vegetation conditions are the worst on record, and if the rains fail this spring, the situation will continue to deteriorate. We're seeing the worst in Somalia, where the effects of drought are being compounded by insecurity. In 2011, nearly 260,000 Somalis, half of them children under 5, died in a famine triggered by what was, at the time, East Africa's worst drought in 60 years. If current trends continue, famine, a term we do not use lightly, could happen again in Somalia. Already, more than 6 million Somalis, over half the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance, and the rate of severe acute malnutrition is rising. The crisis in Somalia also has regional effects, as people leave to look for food and support in neighboring countries. This migration, as well as refugees arriving from South Sudan, strains already depleted neighbors Ethiopia and Kenya. But even with these challenges, these governments are proactively responding to the drought, and USAID is aligning its investments with these country-led efforts. USAID has rapidly scaled up and redirected its efforts, providing vital food and malnutrition treatment, as well as safe water, improved sanitation, and hygiene. And even in the midst of an emergency, we look for opportunities to build resilience and strengthen the community's ability to respond to future shocks and stresses. I recently visited a livestock market that is part of these resilience-building activities in the arid lands of northern Kenya. The market, and others like it, support the livelihood activities of the pastoralists in the region, providing livestock trading and veterinarian services, and in turn spawned opportunities for entrepreneurs in the local economy. Jacob, for instance, fixes the motorcycles of people traveling to and from the new markets, and Mercy runs a restaurant to feed traders using locally grown food. These efforts across the region are expanding economic opportunities, strengthening drought cycle management, and improving health and human capital. Over the long term, a British study estimates that every dollar invested in resilience results in nearly $3 in reduced humanitarian spending, avoided loss, and improved well-being. Challenges remain, however. In South Sudan, years of intense violence has transformed the world's youngest nation into one of the most food insecure in the world. Nearly half of South Sudan's population faces life-threatening hunger this year, and famine was declared in several counties just last month. In northeastern Nigeria, more than 5.1 million people are facing severe food insecurity, and nearly 450,000 children will experience life-threatening severe acute malnutrition this year. Famine likely did occur in 2016, but access has made it difficult to confirm. Lastly, I would be remiss not to mention the situation in Yemen, which is experiencing the largest food security emergency in the world. Conflict, political instability, economic crisis, and rising food and fuel prices have left more than 17 million people food insecure. This situation has repercussions in East Africa as refugees flee to Somalia and Djibouti, who are struggling to handle the influx even as they face their own domestic crises. These broader challenges are important to note because we are never focusing on just one country or region at a time. The United States cannot do it alone. We need the United Nations, affected governments, donor partners, and NGOs like the ones that will be testifying after me to work together to tackle these challenges. I want to thank these partners and our staff at USAID for their tireless efforts and dedication to helping those affected around the world. Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your attention to these issues and for congressional support provided to USAID, especially our humanitarian programs over the years. Please know that your support transforms and saves lives every day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for your testimony, and above all, for your work, which has been tremendous over the years. And obviously, during a crisis like this, it's needed now more than ever. Let me just ask you a few questions. One, the cooperation, about a month ago, you had testified that Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia all pledged regional cooperation and cross-border collaboration to tackle the drought and the underlying fragility in the region. Has there been any fruit to that effort? Are they truly cooperating? And are we ahead of the curve this time, or are we just keeping our head afloat, or are we behind?
Thank you for that question. As far as cooperation efforts of those countries that you mentioned, through IFAD, through the IFAD network, they have brought together leaders of those governments to work better together to address this crisis. I think the efforts, most notably in Kenya and Ethiopia, are showing the greatest strides. For example, the same drought that is affecting Somalia is also affecting those two countries. But those two countries are better able to withstand what's happening. Kenya, for example, is putting $1.6 billion of its own resources towards helping people in Kenya that are affected by this drought. Ethiopia has a long-standing program, a social safety net program, in conjunction with USAID and other donors, as well to be able to better withstand what's going on. So the cooperation definitely has started, and IFAD is in a good position to do this.
Let me ask you, with regards to aid workers, when Greg Simpkins and I were in Juba, again, late August of last year, we kept raising the issue, including with the military, with 5 of the top generals and the defense minister, about the need. This is after the Tehran incident where several aid workers were raped. Many aid workers were beaten, and diplomats. One journalist, a South Sudanese man, was killed. And as it turned out, one of the aid workers, and I didn't know this until about 3 days before we left, was actually from my district. She was not raped, but she was sexually assaulted. And the two military officers that broke in and broke up what was about to become a rape prevented even further tragedy to her. But she has been severely traumatized. She was actually going to testify at a hearing we had on South Sudan, and then just didn't want to. She was going to do it by way of phone with no name attribution, anonymously, but it was just too much to tell the story of what an aid worker goes through. So my question is, the UN panel of experts for South Sudan said that South Sudan is the deadliest in the world for aid workers. It seems to me that whether it be USAID and our mission leaders and people on the ground, or anyone else from the NGO community, we've got to just keep pounding away with these governments and all parties, including rebels, that leave the aid workers alone. There needs to be a sacrosanctness. It's almost like when the Red Cross would show up, even the most hostile of forces would at least allow the white flag for humanitarian purposes to go forward. What can we do to maybe an initial assessment of how bad it really is in each of these countries, and what can we do to make sure that that aid does then flow? And that will include the indigenous aid workers, because sometimes they're picked off and hurt because they're seen, well, they're South Sudanese and nobody will make a big deal about it. Of course, we look at their lives as equally important to everyone else's life. So if you could speak to that.
Chairman Smith, thank you very much for that question. And it's actually incredibly relevant. We just received reports as of yesterday that now it is 7 workers from an indigenous NGO were killed in South Sudan. 3 Kenyans and I think it's now 4 South Sudanese. They worked for a local NGO. USAID does not have a direct relationship with that entity, but they are definitely partners in trying to bring life-saving aid to South Sudan for the greater humanitarian community. I believe that now, since the conflict began in 2013, that we've had over 70 fatalities of aid workers in South Sudan. It is an incredibly dangerous place to work. And I think you're correct in saying that we have to ensure, all donor governments and all operating partners, that the safety of our people are at utmost concern, and that continue to take measures to ensure when they go out to do this work that they are protected, and that all parties know that these are neutral actors in place. This has been an issue that we're not just seeing in South Sudan, we are seeing other parts of the world as well. Part of the World Humanitarian Summit last summer in Turkey talked about this issue, and it's very concerning for donors, especially for our office, where not only do we have our partners, we also have USAID staff as well into these conditions. And this is one of the great changes I think that we've seen in the last 5 years about the nature of conflict and what we're responding to, is that conflicts are not driven necessarily by the natural disasters that they used to be. They're being driven by conflict. Conflict necessarily puts greater risk on our partners. I also think that the people that will be following me will be able to talk in greater detail about some of the actions they're taking.
Let me just ask you, how much money are we allocating towards this crisis? Is there a low estimate, medium estimate, high estimate? What do you think will really be needed? Will there be a request of Congress for additional funding, or do you have enough that you could either reprogram or you already have in? And secondly, on the issue of pre-positioning, again, just having been in Juba, it was appalling that armed forces would go to a WFP warehouse and pretty much strip it clean of all of the foodstuffs that were there, which were intended for extremely hungry people. Pre-positioning has its, and GAO found that, it does save time. It's there in a way that could be accessed quickly, but it does cost money, and then there's the risk of theft. How do we balance all of that? And the idea of WFP tracking food delivery, are we on top of that with them, to make sure that it gets to where it's supposed to be in a timely fashion to alleviate suffering?
Thank you, Chairman, for those questions. Let's talk about some of the numbers. Right now, since 2016, Food for Peace alone has provided, well, since 15 and now 17, including South Sudan, close to $1 billion of resources have been allocated in food resources to all of those affected countries. And that is primarily from the Office of Food for Peace. Our sister office, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in USAID, also has done over $500 million in conjunction with our funding. So I think that there's a robust response from the United States in these crises, and we can break down by country some of these operations, even by partner at a later date if you would like to.
If you could provide that for the record as quickly as possible, that'd be very
Not a problem. We'll definitely be on that as soon as this hearing ends. As far as pre-positioning, especially in South Sudan, but it really goes for other places that we're working as well, but South Sudan is a little bit particular because of the rains in South Sudan. Our partners and the donors work very, 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 very closely to ensure before the rains hit that food is pre-positioned in warehouses throughout the country that needs to be there so that it can be accessed. Conflict will disrupt that our ability to be able to pre-position those warehouses, into those warehouses. The case in Juba you mentioned, WFP in particular took heroic efforts to remove much of the food before the conflict actually began. Not all of the food was taken out, but that warehouse in and of itself, they knew that the conflict actors were coming, and the team moved actually the majority of the food out of that warehouse before the conflict. So our teams on the ground are very adept at being able to know what's going on the ground and protect those resources. There's always a danger in pre-positioning, but because of the access we get when these conditions allow us not able to deliver, having that food in place is of primary importance. So we're going to continue to use that tool to ensure we're best able to respond. Your final question about WFP tracking or being able to account for the resources. This is something of critical importance to USAID in general and definitely our office. We partner with USAID, with WFP and the NGOs to ensure that those that have been targeted are the ones that are receiving the aid. And there's several ways that we do this. First of all is ensuring that those identified are the ones that need the aid. In other words, the most vulnerable are getting it. Our partners are very, very good at ensuring when they go to communities, those relationships that they have, they are able to identify those who are most in need. The second round, when we actually go for distribution, is that we have teams of monitors in place, and we have certain biometric measures that we can employ to ensure that those that have been identified are actually the people that are getting the aid. This can go from a retinal scan to an ID card to even a fingerprint that we would employ to ensure that those people are the ones that are supposed to be getting the aid. And then finally, we would do, especially in places like Somalia and in other places, is a follow-up distribution testing, is a follow-up to ensure that the people have actually received the aid. This can be done through cell phone surveys similar to our Nielsen ratings that we have here in the United States, where we'll do random call of beneficiaries to ensure that they actually did receive the aid, as well as setting up hotlines so that beneficiaries can actually call in to ensure that they've got that. Finally, what we do is that we, USAID, have employed third-party monitorings. These are actually groups of NGOs or other actors that we employ to go back to those areas to ensure that the food that was allocated to those regions actually was delivered to those people that we're supposed to. This all combines to make sure that we have a pretty good eye on what we plan to do actually happens and reaches those needy beneficiaries.
And before yielding to my good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Bass, one issue that we pressed Salva Kiir on relentlessly, and have done so since our trip there in August, his defense minister, his vice president, who I've seen since, is zero tolerance for sexual violence. Violence of all kinds, but including sexual violence. The report on the Tehran installation suggested that they do that, which is what we were asking for, but it still hasn't happened. And until the military, up and down the command at every aspect of it, realizes that its security forces cannot rape and harass people, particularly aid workers, who are seemingly one of the most targeted groups. We really have to raise the bar, I think. I mean, they've promised they would do it. Kiir told us he would do it, told Greg and I face to face, and it's about time it get done. That was in August. So wherever you can find, and I know you're absolutely on board pushing that, but know that we work in tandem, all of us, it's bipartisan. That has got to end, and they need to implement a strategy that is zero tolerance, because just like we had with many of the peacekeepers when they were deployed to Goma and other places, and I had several hearings there, went there, as you know, I wrote the trafficking laws for the United States, Trafficking Victims Protection Act. George W. Bush did a zero tolerance policy for our military, and it holds today, and if somebody violates it, even to the point of prostitution, the Uniform Code of Military Justice is as clear as a bell. It is actionable, and they can go to prison, and they should go to prison, those who violate it. So, you know, Keir, we told them that. We said, you know, we know that years back you had a fondness for President Bush. Well, he did it with our military. Please do it with yours. And he said he would, and he hasn't. So it's a point of great consternation and anger now that they have refused to actually do it. So I just would hope you would convey that too, you know, because again, the people we want to protect are the indigenous South Sudanese, obviously, and the beneficiaries of the aid, and all of those wonderful women and men who put their lives on the line as aid workers to help. So thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you for your efforts on that point.
Thank you very much for coming and giving your testimony today. And I just had a few questions for you. We have a markup in full committee tomorrow, and we have a resolution on the famine. And I just wanted to know what you thought about it. I mean, right now the resolution is focusing on South Sudan, but whether or not you thought Somalia and Nigeria needed to be included as well. That's one question. I also want to ask you about the role of the AU. Is the AU helping? And what role they're playing specifically. And our chairman here was talking about President Kiir in terms of the peacekeepers, but I would also want to know whether or not they've stopped. I don't know if you mentioned this, Mr. Chair, but whether they stopped, they had increased the fees for humanitarian workers. I mean, it was some crazy dollar amount, $10,000 or something, if you wanted to come in and provide humanitarian support. They got condemned internationally for that. I don't know if they have backed away.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bass, for those questions. On the first question about including Somalia and Nigeria with the resolution, the situation in both of those countries is very severe as well. In Nigeria, what we're seeing is over 5 million people at risk of severe food insecurity, and even about the same level in Somalia. The difference in Somalia is that come April, coming the end of this, in about the next 2 or 3 weeks, if the rains fail, which it's still unknown exactly if that's going to happen, we could be seeing even more need, because those are very crucial rains at this time. So it's expected that the needs are going to grow pretty quickly in Somalia as well. And in Nigeria, the real issue has been the lack of access in some of those areas. In fact, zero access in some of them still. And when our partners have had access, they are finding...
Because of Boko Haram or because of other...
Boko Haram, because of activities of Boko Haram, most definitely. And when our partners have had some access, they are finding just horrific conditions on the ground with severe acute malnutrition rates that are really unheard of in quite some time, over 50% in certain cases. So that is a very, very severe crisis. And I can say that I think that the partners have really stepped up their game in Nigeria. I think that there are several issues to contend with, but I think that we are better placed than we were as a humanitarian community than, let's say, even 6 or 8 months ago. That's not to say there's a lot of work left to do, and there's a lot of areas of access that we just are not getting into. Coming back to Somalia, what we're seeing, depending on the rains or not, we are still in the midst of a very serious situation with lots of people, like I said, 5 million people that are really at risk right now. Again, what's a little bit different about this is that Somalia, definitely it's because of a drought that's happening right now. It's not to say that there is intense conflict that is really what got us here, but the drought is what is most concerning. And what we need to do now, and what USAID is doing, is not waiting for this to happen, is acting now. It is moving food into the country now, and it's working with our partners to ensure that we're there. What's a little bit different than the situation now is the fact that we have acted a little bit earlier than before in 2011, as the chairman was saying. And we also have better access, meaning our partners have much better access than they did in 2011. And really, the ability or the viability of al-Shabaab has been reduced. Back in 2011, al-Shabaab was in control of the capital, Mogadishu. That is definitely not the case. What our partners are telling us is that in the urban areas of Somalia, we have pretty good access. We have pretty good sustained access. The rural areas are still of concern. So around 600 to 900,000 people in those rural areas really are still getting limited to no access, and that is very concerning, especially as the famine or the drought conditions worsen. Your question about the AU.
Well, actually, before you go there, but, so in Nigeria, the Nigerian government has also said that Boko Haram was under control. So,
I would not be in a good position to talk about the military and the government's efforts directly on Boko Haram. I can say that our partners definitely feel that there are places that are unsafe for them to access. And similar to Chairman Smith's question about putting our partners in danger, without adequate control of a situation, our partners are just simply not going to go to those places. And that definitely still exists.
the AU?
The AU, the Amazon troops have, I think, had significant impact in Somalia. I think that the combined forces of Kenya and the Ethiopians have really opened up those corridors and really allowed the NGOs to be able to reestablish a very good network and very good operations in there. It is hoped that that continues. And with elections in Kenya and with continuing growth in Ethiopia, it's hoped that that continues. That is a very, I think, good sign of how the AU in general has had positive impact on this. And I think that that will continue.
So, and what about the AU
South
and, and also President Kiir in terms of
Correct.
the aid workers
So
being able to come?
We did hear about a week or so ago about $10,000 per humanitarian worker to
Right.
be able to do this. I can say for certainty right now that that has not occurred, that our partners are still operating, that they have not been asked to pay
Was that
those
not
fees.
true, or he backed away from it, or
I think many things.
kind of important if it wasn't true?
I think that the announcement was made. We believe that it was made, but I think the efforts of the donors, and I think the U.S. ambassador there has made it very clear that this fee is untenable and will not be paid. And I think that that has had substantial impact on it going forward.
So let me ask you a question. In the president's proposed budget with a 30+% cut to USAID, if that cut actually went through, how would you respond to this situation that you're facing now?
So we at USAID, we have seen the president's blueprint, and it hasn't specifically mentioned cuts to USAID or to Food for Peace. And we continue to work on the budget, but I have no information exactly on the cuts for 2018 or the potential impacts that's going to have on our budget.
Okay, I thought that there was a significant cut to USAID that was proposed.
I think that there have been proposed cuts as the exact impact of what that's going to be and how that's going to be, especially on the humanitarian side, we really have no information at this time. I feel that it's my job to make sure that with the resources we're given by Congress as it goes through, that we make the tough choices that are going to be there in the future, and that we continue to stress the most vulnerable and the most needy in the world.
Is there anything else you think Congress should be doing right now?
I think having hearings exactly like this that bring attention to what's going on, not just in Somalia, but I do think Somalia needs attention, but other places in the world is incredibly crucial. I think the chairman's efforts on bringing the safety of humanitarians, the workers, as well as the protection issue that is definitely apparent in so many of these conflict situations is incredibly useful. When we are able to get you all to come out to see some of these programs, that is phenomenal as well. Your visits to the field have tremendous impact for your understanding it, but also for us to elevate the situations.
So is the chairman going to go?
Yes.
Maybe I'll go with you.
That'd be great.
I'll yield.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, the ranking member asked about the situation in Somalia and Ethiopia. I would just give you carte blanche to extend whether or not there's relevant crisis in any other nations and leave that open-ended. Specifically, obviously, when you look on the map, you see the Republic of the Sudan, obviously North and South Sudan and other surrounding areas. So, and these sorts of humanitarian crises, particularly as it relates to famine, generally don't respect borders. Are there other areas where we might consider the application of assistance?
Thank you, Mr. Member. What I have not talked a lot about, which was a little bit in my opening statement, is the situation in Yemen. And I think the numbers alone in Yemen, where we're looking at close to 17 million people that are severely food insecure, and with the pending conflict and the existing conflict and how that's going to go, is definitely need for concern. And because of the proximity of Yemen to East Africa, that is a place where that will be impacted by maybe refugees coming in or large movements of population. So Yemen is a place where access is very difficult. 90% of Yemen's food is imported, and quite frankly, the humanitarian assistance alone is just not going to be able to impact that situation if there's a full collapse of the market or even the ability to import food. I think that we should be keeping a close eye on Yemen. One aspect on South Sudan, I think, and just yesterday, the head of the World Food Programme's emergency divisions came in to talk to us about some issues. She's here in town and is going to talk about these kind of 4 areas that we're talking about. And what was surprising to me is that she brought up as bad as South Sudan is and how it has just trended down, quite frankly, over the last 3 years, that she is most concerned about that moving quickly into even a worse status. And a lot of that is because of the continued conflict and what she's seeing. And I tend to agree that South Sudan is on a simmer and could very easily go into a boil very, very quickly. And I think that we have to continue our vigilance on what's going on in South Sudan. And the conflict makes it incredibly difficult for us to be able to do what needs to be done as humanitarians.
So, Mr. Nims, obviously you're here and we're speaking about a humanitarian crisis that the vast bulk of the world's not aware of. To that end, is there something with which the common sort of observer of world events might put this on scale with? Can you compare it to this crisis to another humanitarian crisis to provide scale?
So what we've been saying in humanitarian circles is that we have not seen this level of need or population movement or refugees since World War II. So in fact, this is unprecedented in really, quite frankly, human history, the level of need. I think it's important to say that even in the case of Somalia, where we're seeing a drought, that every single one of these 4 major conflicts in northern Nigeria, in South Sudan, in Yemen, and in Somalia, are all primarily due to conflict. These are man-made situations. And I think it's important for us to understand that as dedicated as the people in USAID, as dedicated as the people who will be talking to me afterwards, humanitarian assistance cannot solve these crises. We really need to have political solutions. We need strong leadership from the UN and other places to be able to bring cogent solutions to what's going on. We didn't talk about Syria or what's going on in Iraq. These are similar, long-standing crises that are really exist because of man-made conflict. And we cannot, in a sense, as we say, HA, humanitarian assistance, ourselves out of this.
So are there any regional players who, if they were to change attitudinally, might be of key assistance as it relates to getting the aid where it needs to go? I mean, obviously in Yemen, for example, there's real challenges just getting on the ground, much less getting aid where it needs to go. Are there any countries where if they were to sort of change the current status of their activities in their own region that would be able to be particularly helpful, and who and how so?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I think you're getting into a realm of me as an operator. I definitely can look
Sure,
at the
I respect
situation
that.
that's going on. I think that we have talked to our State Department colleagues, and they're in a much better position to answer some of those questions, and
Fair
I
enough.
appreciate those.
Yeah, no, I get that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett. Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for your testimony today. And I apologize if I asked something that's been asked. Right, I had my Western Hemisphere Subcommittee hearing at the same time, so I've been in and out. But let me ask you, how will the reduced U.S. contributions to U.S. peacekeeping affect the humanitarian situations in South Sudan and Sudan?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I'm really not able to say exactly how reduced funding to any one group, especially on that level of the UN, would have a direct impact. I do know that the peacekeeping force in South Sudan, for example, has a critical role to play. But the level of funding from the U.S. or other agencies, I'm not really able to say what that exact impact would be.
But I suspect that reduced funding probably wouldn't be helpful, right?
I would agree that probably it
Yeah.
would not be helpful.
Let me ask you, as far as you know, what is China's commitment to humanitarian aid in Africa and in this region in particular?
Thank you for that question. I am not fully versed on exactly the levels that we have seen from the government of China as far in humanitarian assistance. I do know that USAID and the State Department have been engaging with officials from China to increase their role in humanitarian assistance, and I believe that China recently has announced some bits of funding for Somalia, for example, but I don't know those exact numbers, and we can definitely get back to you on what those figures have been.
Well, part of the reason I asked, for example, is because China has been more active in Africa and the continent generally in terms of economic development and investment, and I wonder if they've also stepped more aggressively into the humanitarian aid role.
I do think that they have increased some of their funding in certain ways, and we are hopeful that it will continue. And I know that we have efforts to engage them on the humanitarian sphere, specifically on how to engage with the UN and other actors. But we can get you more of that information at a later time.
And of course, we want the aid to get there regardless of where it comes from, right? You want people to be helped when they need help. But I've said before that the president's posture towards many nations around the world and his scaling back of funding for things like humanitarian aid are making the United States take a back seat to other countries when it comes to being a leader in the world. Part of that is not only economic engagement, but also this kind of aid. And when you couple this scaling back with the hostility that he's shown towards countries like Mexico, for example, allies around the world, or Germany, Australia, I think it puts the United States in a very precarious position and also allows a nation, an economic competitor of ours, a nation like China, to step forward and really become an even stronger leader around the world. And that Xi Jinping, the president of China, probably sees Africa as a further opportunity in addition to what they've done economically there. To step up and be helpful in ways that it looks like this administration is committed to backing away from. What do you think about that?
I think that USAID has been, and especially the Office of Food for Peace and our sister office, OFDA, have enjoyed tremendous support from members of Congress. And really what we have been able to do over the last 3 years has really saved countless lives. And I think that we look forward to continued support to be able to do what we do, because as I said earlier, I think we are looking at an unprecedented time of need. And I hope that we will be able to continue to do that.
No, I appreciate that. And we want you all to be successful. I worked with USAID on the Global Development Lab legislation that we got through the House and couldn't quite get through the Senate. Hopefully it'll get through this term. But I would hate to see the work of this Congress, and the chairman I know has worked on these issues a lot. I'd hate to see your work and the work of this Congress undone by a lack of commitment going forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kester. Mr. Davis, thank you very much for your testimony. We do have a series of 4 votes, and I apologize, so we'll have a brief suspension of this committee. But I would point out that the president does propose, and we dispose in the House and Senate. I've been here 37 years. I'm in my 37th year as a member of the House. We fought hard and pushed back when Obama wanted to cut tuberculosis and cut it significantly. He wanted to cut neglected tropical diseases, and we have a major bill that I've introduced on neglected tropical diseases, down from 100 million to about 82 million. Thankfully, the bipartisan will be pushed back. So, I don't know if it's OMB or it's the president, but we always seem to have people in the White House that talk a good game, and then we end up not getting what we think we should get. I do think, the Congress will very carefully, both the authorizers and the appropriators, look at these budgets and make sure that we get humanitarian aid to where it is needed most, and to do it in a way that does our American public proud that we care for the least of our brethren. So I want to thank you for and I mean that by situationally, of course, because they are disadvantaged by famine. Thank you so much, Mr. Nims, and we stand in recess for about 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Subcommittee will resume its sitting, and again, I apologize for the delay because of the votes. I don't think we'll have another vote for a long time, so thank you for your patience. We'll begin now with our second panel, beginning first with Mr. Ken Isaacs, who serves as Vice President of Programs and Government Relations for Samaritan's Purse. He has served as the Director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance within the USAID. He coordinated the United States government response to the Indonesian tsunami, the Pakistani earthquake, humanitarian relief efforts in both Darfur and southern Sudan, as well as the Niger and Ethiopia emergency responses. He led Samaritan's Purse's organizational efforts in Liberia in response to Ebola and testified before the subcommittee on that very issue in 2014. We'll then hear from Mr. Michael Bowers, who is the Vice President, Humanitarian Leadership and Response for Mercy Corps. In this capacity, he is responsible for leading and supporting Mercy Corps' global emergency operations, enhancing their quality and accountability, and ensuring that they bring the greatest benefit to people in need. Mr. Bowers has directed the agency's activities in sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, and Asia, managing programs in food security, shelter, agriculture, and economic development. Mr. Bowers recently led Mercy Corps' humanitarian assistance programs in Turkey and in northern Syria in 2017. We'll then hear from Tabane Maposa, who is Partnership Leader for Food Assistance at World Vision International and Acting Senior Director for the Food Security and Livelihoods team at World Vision United States. In these roles, he leads a global team of technical specialists across the World Vision Partnership to deliver quality food assistance programming. His career has included 12 years at World Vision, working in numerous countries in Southern Africa. Currently serves as the representative of World Vision International on the World Food Program's Executive Board. Finally, we will hear from Ms. Faustine Wabwire, who is Bread for the World's Institute Senior Foreign Policy Analyst at the Institute. Ms. Wabwire provides policy leadership on issues including climate change, global poverty and hunger, social protection, the need for strong institutions and local capacity, and the role of effective U.S. partner countries in multilateral assistance in providing solutions. Prior to joining Bread for the World Institute, Ms. Wabwire held a number of positions in academia, research, and international development at the national, regional, and global levels. I'd like to now yield the floor and welcome back Mr. Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the representatives and all the fellow guests of the committee for the opportunity to speak here today on behalf of those suffering as a result of what is being referred to as a quiet famine in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda. And the numbers have been gone over in much greater detail this morning than I need to enumerate now. But I will say a couple of things that the crisis is a result of many factors. Certainly there's the weather, there's market influences. But what I really want to focus on is South Sudan. We are working in an area, Mayandit, that has officially been declared as a famine zone. And between South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda, Samaritan's Purse is feeding probably 2 million people a month. So we have a large presence there. We have large activity. We have solid relationships with the Food for Peace program, with OFDA, and particularly with the World Food Program. And I want to acknowledge their great contribution to everything that is going on there. So in the most significant driver of the current crisis in the worst hit area of South Sudan is political insecurity and brutal conflict, and it continues to engulf the region. In South Sudan alone, I've got a number here, 1.85 million people have been internally displaced, leaving their homes and their crops behind as they flee for their lives. A week ago Sunday, we had 15 of our staff, our national staff, were abducted. They were taken at 2 o'clock in the morning. They came into our compound, and they kept them for 3 days. Thankfully, no one was hurt. There was no ransom made, but it had to do with the local dynamic over humanitarian assistance. And this shows some of what was being talked about earlier from Congresswoman Bass about the dangers to humanitarian workers. And it is a growing problem. The 7 that were killed just 2 days ago, the problem is that the central government doesn't control the people with the guns anymore. They have control over the main elements of the SPLA, but there are so many factions and factions of factions and factions of factions that you can make a deal with somebody, you can get a permission, and you don't know that that's going to extend over into the next village. As a result of the insecurity there, what Samaritan's Purse has done is, to be honest, it has caused us to create our own security department that reaches all the way back to headquarters, so we have a separate analysis and can monitor our people, whether that is electronically, we track them. The negotiations that go on are all consuming. But the safety of our staff is important. There was, let me get back here, I lost my train of thought. I think that the United States needs to maintain its leadership in humanitarian response around the world. And with all of the talk that's going on of budget cuts, I don't know where that's going down, and I don't want to get into the politics of it. But there is criticism going around about development aid, or a lot of times you hear sort of a broad term, we're going to cut development money. I think that there needs to be a clear delineation in the thinking of people's minds between humanitarian assistance and development money. Even at the end of wars, America has always fed people. We fed our enemies. And I don't think that food should be a bargaining chip, and I don't think that food should be a tool of diplomacy. I think that giving humanitarian aid represents the best of the heart and the spirit of the American people. And I think that whatever it takes to do that, in supporting Food for Peace and supporting a World Food Program, I believe that we need to make that effort. I think that there are also some things that could be considered that would be very beneficial in food reform, food aid reform. The system right now, pretty much, there's some flexibility for local purchase with cash, but I think that if that could be reviewed for even more flexibility, and that means to buy commodities out of local markets, arrange local logistics, that would not only stimulate local economies, but frequently you would be able to get more food at a better buy. In Uganda, 1.5 million people are in phase 3 of a food crisis situation. 800,000 of them have come from South Sudan. Right now we are feeding about 60,000 a month. In 2 weeks that number is going to go up to about 300,000 a month. The pressure that's being created in the region from the insecurity is going to breed more insecurity, is what's going to happen. So you have a situation where the lack of food is not only causing suffering, people are moving for food, people are selling their goods for food, they're sort of using up their coping mechanisms. You know, a famine is, here's a great analogy of a famine, it's like a big tree when the wind blows. The wind blows and the tree leans and it comes back up. And the wind blows harder and it leans a little bit more and it comes back up. But there's a point, if the wind blows over, the tree can't get back up. And in those areas that the FuseNet has declared as a famine zone, it's there now. So what this means from an optical perspective, just speaking candidly and from a human perspective, is that a lot of people are going to die. And I think that it is important that that be said, that people know that the Congress knows that, and that we carefully consider the role that we want the United States to play in that. So I think that I'll leave you today with 4 points to sort of simplify this. One is that the famine and the situation is severe. 2, the crisis is a result of many things, but in the worst areas, it's resulting from conflict and lack of access and insecurity. 3, I think it requires sustained American diplomatic leadership to have an effect there. Somebody asked earlier about the AU and what they're doing. You know, I can't pass judgment on the AU. I can just say, look at what's going on in South Sudan and make your own conclusion. And I think also that the situation requires sustained U.S. leadership in the provision of humanitarian goods. I think saving lives is representative of American values. Thank you for letting me talk to you.
Thank you very much for your testimony and even more importantly, for your extraordinary leadership. We've been joined by Elliot Engel, the ranking member of the full committee. Anything?
I'll be brief. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass. I'm very grateful as the ranking member to the subcommittee for calling this hearing and bringing attention to the grave humanitarian crises that's worsening in East Africa. I mean, worsening, it's really scary because it's been pretty bad up till now. The UN estimates that nearly 300 million people in East Africa don't have the food they need. Right now, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan face dire food needs, while parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda face a crisis nearly as bad. For several years, seasonal rains have failed in the Horn of Africa, a direct result of climate change. And looking ahead, this crisis holds the potential for massive displacement. So we have an extreme weather condition caused by climate change. We have a worsening famine. We have a brewing displacement crisis. These sound like the sort of issues our State Department and USAID are designed to grapple with. So I'll reiterate the points I made this morning at our full committee hearing. The administration's request to cut our international affairs budget by 1/3 would be devastating. The lack of leadership in senior roles, including USAID Administrator, Director of USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, Assistant Secretary for Africa, Assistant Secretary for Population and Refugees and Migration. It makes it impossible for our agencies to do their jobs because these slots have not yet been filled. American leadership is vital, and so far this administration, by its actions, is undermining our country's role in the world. Among the two worst cases we see are in Somalia and South Sudan. I'd like to briefly focus on those. Between 2010 and 2012, Somalia suffered through the worst drought and famine in 20 years, failed harvests, a spike in food prices, and insecurity that impeded the delivery of food and aid exacerbated this crisis. It's exacerbating as well, exasperating. 250,000 Somali refugees lost their lives, including 133,000 children under the age of 5. That is just breaks your heart to see that. And the main lesson learned from that tragedy was that humanitarian assistance came too late, and we need to remember that lesson today. More than 6 million people are in need of assistance in Somalia, and nearly 3 million face crisis or emergency levels of food insecurity. If the April to June rains fail again, this situation could worsen quickly, potentially leading to another humanitarian tragedy and massive displacement in the Horn, which in turn could lead to instability in Kenya and Ethiopia. I'll soon offer a resolution supporting ongoing efforts by our government, along with the UN and the donor community, to help meet the challenge of drought and food insecurity in the Horn of Africa. Turning to South Sudan, more than 40% of the population, nearly 5 million people, currently face severe life-threatening hunger. By July, that number will likely rise another 500,000. Last month, the UN declared 100,000 people to be coping with famine conditions. The security situation on the ground remains dire. This past weekend, 6 aid workers were ambushed and brutally murdered in South Sudan. Since December 2013, nearly 80 aid workers have been killed. The United States and our partners have taken on the tall order of distributing food and other necessities to those in need. Many of the worst-off communities are inaccessible by road for most of the year, and last month, famine was declared in two counties in South Sudan. So we need to continue providing humanitarian support and pressuring the government in South Sudan and the armed opposition to put the needs of their people first. And I'm pleased to co-sponsor Ranking Member Bass's resolution calling for strong support to address the family there. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to the subcommittee for dealing with these difficult issues. I'm grateful to our panelists, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. Dan Donovan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for not being here early. I was at a budget briefing that my good friend Elliot Engel from New York was just talking about. I understand that part of the crisis is caused by nature, and there's nothing we could do about a drought. But some of the other difficulties is either lack of aid, disruption of delivery of aid, What are, and you may have, this may be repeating because I wasn't here when you all testified, but are those the two main problems that we're facing? Not enough aid and the disruption of delivery of aid? Are there other issues that we should be knowing about so that if this can be addressed congressionally, that we'll be able to at least understand the causations?
Thank you, Congressman. Access is an issue. Access is an issue because it's insecure, because humanitarian workers are a target of opportunity, or they can become a target of political opportunity. So that puts our staff in danger. That's a problem. And there's some generalized breakdown over the last 15 years on this issue that humanitarian workers don't get a neutral space, I'll call it. But I think that also some of the decisions and the steps that the government of South Sudan are taking are hurting themselves. One of them is the $10,000 per person fee for a work permit for foreigners. Another one that is problematic is they want to nationalize the staff. But we understand that, and we have always worked with that. They've said that they wanted 10% of the staff only to be expatriates. So we have in South Sudan about 900 staff, and we've got like 35 or 40 expatriates. But now they have actually come back and said this position has to be a South Sudanese, this position has to be. So you're talking about complicated financial matters, you're talking about the oversight that this committee and other committees would be interested in on the use of U.S. food, and that requires expertise and skill. And if you look around, you would see that in South Sudan, maybe 75% of the people are illiterate. So they just as a nation have not built the capacity to fill the positions that they're calling for us to fill, and they're putting pressure on us, and they have sort of tied all of that together to the issuance of work permits. So they're not creating an inviting environment for NGOs to come in and help. And I think that at the very best, they need to put off whatever rules that they think need to be enforced for 36 months or something. They need, as a nation, to get through this famine. I mean, they got all kinds of other wars and other issues going on, but it is complicated to work there. It is dangerous to work there, and some of the government policies that we see being demanded are counterproductive, in my personal opinion.
Can you just expound on the disruption of delivery? Is that caused by government entities? Is that caused by some of the people that are involved in the conflicts?
So we had, 15 people abducted a week and a half ago, and they are a faction of a faction, and no one is in control of them. So it was the local military garrison leader that made the decision that he was going to come through our compound wall at 2 o'clock in the morning, threaded his way past an SPLM garrison. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to point fingers. I got to go back and work with everybody. It's important. But what I'm saying is that the command and control structures, that's multiple structures, are weak and they're fragile. And so you end up with a lot of guys with guns out in the bush, and then they develop their own political thinking, and then they decide to take action. And that could be exercised probably what happened when these people were ambushed and killed 2 days ago on the way to Pibor. You don't know how that's going to be manifested, but it creates an atmosphere of insecurity, and too often humanitarian workers are the target of that.
The items that are confiscated through a disruption is the folks that you're speaking about now.
So I don't know anything firsthand about a black market. That's not unusual in a war zone, but I will say this about South Sudan, is that their inflation has been so enormous over the past couple of years, and the availability of food is so low. I think that food is going to go to feed hungry people. Even if somebody steals it, they may get some money, but it's still going to all feed hungry people. Having your trucks looted is not what you want. But I don't have firsthand knowledge with large black market activity there.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to comment
Maybe
on
if we
it?
could, just get through all the witnesses.
Yep.
And then, but
Absolutely.
it's a great question. It's a very good question. Maybe you could incorporate that into your testimony. But Mr. Bowers, please.
By the way, I worked with Mr. Isaacs before when we were trying to combat famine in North Korea. Mercy Corps and Samaritan's Purse had a large program there. So it's always good to be with esteemed colleagues. But good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify. Mercy Corps is a leading global organization that specializes in humanitarian development and peace-building programs. We operate in more than 40 countries around the world, including throughout East Africa region, and all 4 of the countries considered at risk of famine. As you've heard, the current drought in the Horn of Africa is more intense and widespread than in 2011. Although severe drought plays its part, the regional situation is made worse by man-made causes that we've been talking about today, which include a deadly mix of conflict, marginalization, displacement, violent extremism, and climate change. Moreover, insufficient investment in conflict prevention, resilience, and sustainable development activities allow these problems to fester, extending these crises unnecessarily. While the immediate priority must be saving lives, building resilience and addressing conflict and violence cannot wait. Across the region, we are working with our local partners to deliver food, water, sanitation supplies, healthcare, and education in these emergencies. Where appropriate, we try to provide cash assistance as well that allows families to buy the items they need most. And maybe, Congressman, to your point, where we are seeing opportunities and where markets can bear and food is available, giving people the dignity and ability to buy their own food avoids this black market issue, and it avoids, obviously, a costly pipeline of food where we can. In South Sudan, we provide communities with emergency water and sanitation services, including responding to the recent cholera outbreak, and we're distributing crop and vegetable seeds, fishing nets, and agricultural tools so that people can get an option to grow their own food and rebuild their lives. In Somalia, primarily with private funds, we are rapidly bolstering ongoing livelihood programming while also responding to the increasing food insecurity. This includes providing water and emergency wet feeding to over 21 schools in the central regions of the country that are most severely impacted. Not only are we saving lives there, but we're ensuring access to education of over 4,000 school children continue. In Ethiopia, in addition to treating malnutrition in the Somali region, we are responding to the drought with a commercial destocking project that allows income to households that derive their income from livestock, protects the livestock assets of pastoralists, and preserves the deteriorating rangeland. There, we're stimulating market linkages as well between traders and producers and supports the market prices of livestock. In Kenya to date, we've talked a little about Kenya with Matt Nims. There's been little donor funding released for the emergency response due to the drought to help bolster the efforts of the government, which is sizable and is doing much what they can. However, funding exists for the drought response has in large part been through private means. I was in Kenya in 2011 during that drought response as that unfolded in Somalia and witnessed the consequences of that ignoring early action. If we fail to respond now, we risk a much larger and costly emergency response later with too many lives lost in the meantime. Although funding is also needed across the region, we are barely scratching the surface of what we've had. And I think a question that the chairman posed earlier today, is there enough money in FY 2017 from the U.S. government? And I will say no, there is not. And I would employ this Congress to not rescind the $360 million that's on the table for current FY17. If that is done so, over 8 million people, almost immediately, but certainly in the short term, will be left without food. Another question raised the issue, I think Congressman Garrett brought it up, is why is this famine and hunger crisis not getting the attention it did in 2010, 2011? Well, in part, we've seen this before, that the media, by and large, drives a lot of attention of your constituents. But if you think of it this way, 20 million people right now are at risk of starvation. That is the combined population of the state of New Jersey and North Carolina. So if you're speaking to your constituents and the American taxpayers wondering why should we spend money there, or talking to the administration, I would remind them of what Mr. Isaacs just said in terms of our moral obligations, but also just the sheer numbers. So in addition to funding, we are also needing access in conflict zones, as has been mentioned before. Aid workers continue to be killed, injured, or harassed. Horrifyingly, these 7 individuals that were lost last weekend in South Sudan are not a strange trend. That is something that is continuing. Without safe access to deliver food, water, and vital supplies, especially in areas which are on the brink of starvation, we will not be able to save lives, frankly. Besides the urgent need to respond now, I'd also stress we can do more to prevent these food crises in the future and now. To improve food security in the region, we need to implement a variety of programs that strengthen community resilience. New evidence that we have from a USAID-funded program in Ethiopia called PRIME confirms that food security resilience programs can help communities survive crises and stop the cycle of recurrent humanitarian disasters. Even as we respond urgently to the crisis in East Africa, we must continue to build these communities' ability to cope and with shocks and stress in the future. That innovation of that resilience approach, by the way, was embraced with the Global Food Security Act, which I have to thank Chairman Smith, as well as the rest of this committee, for helping pass that important bill. Finally, because conflict also directly and indirectly impacts hunger across East Africa, we need to support programs that address conflict where it is happening and mitigate potential spillover effects that further stress neighboring countries and exacerbate food insecurity. This is why we focus on enhancing the capacity of people and institutions to prevent and manage conflict. And this is something very important for the Congress to take into consideration as they look through their appropriations. You and Congress have an integral role to play in helping prevent the spread of famine and create conditions that mitigate food crises from happening in the first place. I've provided a more detailed list of recommendations, including budgetary issues, in my written statement. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize again that we ask the Congress urgently provide life-saving assistance in FY17 and FY18 through its appropriations process to address ongoing humanitarian needs by funding IDA and FFP fully, and that would be $1 billion. Invest in building the resilience of vulnerable communities to prepare for, withstand, and recover from these shocks and stresses, and prevent and manage conflict by fully funding Food for Peace, non-emergency programs, including the Economic Support Fund and development assistance. And finally, encourage the administration, as Mr. Isaacs mentioned, to aggressively pursue diplomatic efforts by fully staffing the State Department and USAID to end these conflicts and remove obstacles for humanitarians seeking populations in need. 20 years from now, when we approach this time, we'll want to say what we did to conclude everything we could to save lives and turn this story of starvation into one of recovery. I thank you, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Stars, thank you so very much for your leadership as well and the recommendations you've made. They will go from you to a whole lot of people from this hearing, so I do thank you for that. Mr. Mapusa.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the East Africa hunger crisis. Your continued leadership and focus on these humanitarian issues is critical and it matters. I testify today on behalf of World Vision, but also as a person born and raised in Africa who has experienced hunger on several occasions in my native country of Zimbabwe. In 1983, a civil war or a near civil war in the southern part of the country disrupted farming activities, and many were left without food, including my family. In 1992, a major drought across the country meant there was not enough food for a greater part of the year. It was then that I first experienced firsthand the generosity of the American people when my family received the yellow corn, famously called Kenya in my country because it was coming through Mombasa. While the focus of my testimony today is to put light to the unfolding situation in East Africa, I also want to take this opportunity, Chairman, to say thank you to you and the members and the American people for the help that you provided to me during my hardest time 25 years ago. Those who testified before me today have captured the real and the grim situation in South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. The crisis is affecting over 20 million people who require urgent and life-saving assistance. There are other pressing humanitarian needs across the globe, as you mentioned earlier on, when we touched on Yemen, Nigeria, and the like. But what is unique about East Africa is that a formal famine declaration has been issued in parts of South Sudan. As an African, I would like to tell you that it is very uncommon for African governments to lift their hands and declare these famines. And when they often do, it is a little too late. Without an elevated and immediate response, we are greatly concerned that the situation could worsen in regions of South Sudan, Somalia, and other countries as well. We have spoke today about the refugee situation. World Vision is working in Kenya, Uganda. In Uganda, we are receiving refugees. We are currently have a caseload of 200,000 refugees that we are dealing with, and that number has not stopped. They are coming, as Isaac said, 2,000 a day crossing into the country. So the burden of South Sudan is actually spilling over to other countries, and that needs to be noted. World Vision's mission requires us to work tirelessly to address the needs of children and their families. As a child-focused organization, we are particularly concerned about the more than 3.5 million children under 5 who are acutely malnourished, and the nearly 850,000 children who are severely malnourished. Interventions made today will not only save their lives, but also reduce the possibility of long-term chronic malnutrition and stunting that can occur in the first critical 1,000 days of a child's life. World Vision has been a partner in these response efforts, and specifically in East Africa, where we have been operational for the last 2 to 3 decades. We have experienced achievements and challenges, and we have refined our programming, and we have used every lesson that we have learned. While this crisis remains complex, I would like to present 3 key recommendations or points for this committee's consideration. The United States government must maintain its position as a global leader through continued and robust support of humanitarian development programs. For example, I would like to highlight the flexibility that we have seen shown by Food for Peace in places where programs were already existing, and they made sure that they extended those programs to respond and to pivot to the needs that were emerging. We have also seen great coordination between the Office of Disaster Assistance and the Foreign Disaster Assistance and Food for Peace, where they have tried to coordinate to make sure that their resources are stretched and go much further. But furthermore, it is essential to note that the US government cannot be alone in these things. As such, other governments, international donors, and humanitarian actors should all join and act swiftly to prevent the crisis from worsening. Just like my colleagues have said, I would like to urge this subcommittee to advocate for funding and programs that will respond to this crisis. This includes strong support to the international affairs budget as Congress finalizes 2017 spending bills and begins discussions around 2018 appropriations. The US government and its partners need to adopt a multi-year, multi-sector funding to achieve lasting impact in fragile contexts. We can thus empower communities to pull themselves out of poverty and create a more enabling environment that mitigates against future shocks. We have experienced this in our work with USAID and the World Food Programme in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Kenya. And I would say that a little story from South Sudan, when I visited sometime last year, we saw this community that we had been giving food for a while, but over a certain period when we invested in resilience projects, and this was a fish ponds and what have you, in just a year, we didn't need to actually be helping that family. And sometimes I think it is important to help those in need, but come out of that space of needing to help them again. During these crises, one of the things that I've noted is that resources are disproportionately skewed towards the short term. No wonder we find ourselves in the same situation too often. Our investment needs to be balanced, and we need to have staying power. Last but not least, while we do our best as humanitarians, we call upon recipient governments, donor governments, and the African Union to seek political solutions to the conflict that continues to undermine food security in some of these countries. I think it has been pointed out well today that it is not only undermining it for the long term, but also in the short term. I want to reiterate that your leadership counts. One story that hasn't been told here today is that we have made tremendous progress in our fight against hunger. The number of hungry people has dropped by 200 million since 1992, and I am one of those that in 1992 needed yellow maize from this country. We know the decisions are hard, but we are also aware how close we are to achieving a hunger-free world. Thank you for taking an important step today by holding this critical hearing. We thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Maposa, thank you very much for your leadership and for being a person who, having been helped, has been helping others ever since. And so thank you. That is a tremendous witness to all of us of someone who just gives back and gives back and gives back some more. So thank you. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Waresay. The floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify before the subcommittee today on this important and critically important issue of drought and famine in the East Africa region. I'm here in my capacity as the Senior Foreign Assistance Policy Advisor for Bread for the World Institute. Bread for the World advocates for policies and programs to end hunger. Our 2017 hunger report, focuses on the urgency of addressing crises in some of the world's most fragile environments, including those we are here to talk about today. I'd like to mention that I have a copy of our most recent report, which outlines some of the strategies that governments could do, that multilateral agencies could do, and what governments themselves are doing to address such crises. Given the scale and the severity of the crisis, Mr. Chairman, Bread for the World urges Congress to reject the administration's proposed skinny budget cuts to foreign assistance in the face of such a serious crisis. The proposed cuts include slashing or eliminating altogether the very accounts that finance the U.S. government support for emergency response. And I would just like to highlight 3 specific accounts that would be severely impacted if the cuts in fact come to effect. One is the Food for Peace account, which funds food aid. The second is the International Disaster Assistance, which funds non-food items, including water and medical services. We know what conditions look like in refugee camps. They are breeding grounds for all kinds of diseases, so this account is critically important. The third account I would like to highlight is the Migration and Refugee Assistance, which provides U.S. support to refugees in neighboring countries. For example, refugee crisis right now residing in Somalia, in Kenya and Ethiopia. Mr. Chairman, I would like to focus my remarks on 3 points today. The fact, and has been rightly mentioned by my colleague on the panel, this crisis comes at a time when we have made tremendous progress against hunger and poverty around the world. And it can be overwhelming because a lot of people think we keep doing this, but where's the evidence that we're actually making a dent? I'm here to testify that in 1990, approximately 1 in 4 people lived with hunger on a daily basis. By 2015, the hunger rate was cut nearly in half and stood at 1 in 9. Over the same period, Mr. Chairman, extreme poverty was cut in half by even more, 1 in 3 people in the world to 1 in 10. That is progress. Countries across the continent have invested in efforts to address hunger and poverty, including reducing stunting, which, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, is a serious, in fact, it's a hidden hunger issue. We know that when children are affected by hunger, especially in the critical window between birth and 2 years old, their cognitive development is severely affected. It means that even when they grow up, they are not as productive individuals of society, cannot contribute to the economic growth that we all hope to see in their own respective countries. These trends reinforce my belief in the feasibility of ending hunger and poverty. I must acknowledge that at the same time, conflict and severe droughts related to a rapidly changing climate are making it much harder for countries to keep up with the progress that I just mentioned. I recently visited Kenya in December 2015 and January 2017. One of the things that really struck me was the effect of the drought, especially on communities that have managed to feed themselves all of these decades, but are now in severe need of assistance. The early warning system, as has mentioned earlier, is a great tool that today helps us assess the extent of the crisis and find ways to mitigate its effect. FuseNet mentions that today 6.2 million people in Somalia are are in dire need of food assistance, and especially if the oncoming expected rains in the April season will not be to the level that's supposed to be. It's noteworthy also to mention that although we have this kind of cycle of issues going on in Somalia, we are at a much different place. And I would like to echo what Mr. Matthews mentioned earlier, that there's relatively more access to communities in Somalia compared to when we had the famine in 2011. In 2011, I also remember that we did not have any form of government in place. The entire country was pretty much under the control of the militant group Al-Shabaab. Some progress has been made to that front, and as we speak right now, there is a government in place in Somalia. In fact, the government has declared the drought a national disaster and is willing to work with partners to address this. So that's an opportunity right there that we can jump onto. I would like to mention that at a time of intense debate over the US budget and proposed cuts to foreign aid, let us remember that investing in food security helps to promote economic growth. It also promotes global stability, which we all wish for. My final point is about the fact that we are not a hopeless people. We have the tools that we need to address this crisis. The United States has demonstrated leadership through a range of tools, including long-term development assistance, humanitarian assistance, as some of my fellow panelists have already mentioned. I would just want to focus on one of the long-term development programs that I'm very familiar with and which I would like all of you to support and continue to exercise your leadership on, because it has made such progress in the countries where it works. Feed the Future is the US government's global food security initiative. It complements funding from countries themselves, works with American businesses and universities to promote long-term agricultural development. It takes a comprehensive and sustainable approach such that countries own their own plans and eventually are able to fund their own initiatives. In addition to all the bilateral assistance I mentioned, I would also like to add that US leadership in the multilateral world is critically important. An example that I would like to highlight and which has helped to see the gains that we are seeing in Somalia today is the United Nations Peace Fund. This fund promotes coexistence and peaceful resolution in conflict. It supports governments' priorities for stabilization and peace, and also focuses on creating jobs. Another important multilateral program that the US government participates in is the World Bank's International Development Association. It also focuses on supporting countries build local institutions, strengthening governance issues, which are so critical to addressing some of the issues we are talking about, and prevent future calamities from happening. At this point, I would just like to offer 3 broad points upon which I believe that a US government response strategy should look like. The administration and Congress should quickly adopt a response that does 3 things: that combines food assistance and cash vouchers, allowing people to purchase food in local markets. It should also specialize on nutrition for most at-risk populations such as children, pregnant women, and the elderly. And finally, provide financial and logistical support to countries that host refugees to prevent the spillover effects like have been mentioned before. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you
you may have.
for your testimony and your leadership as well. Let me begin, if I could, ask you a question. Others might want to join in on an answer as well. And thank you for underscoring the devastating impact of stunting. The outward appearance is mirrored by an inner tragedy that occurs when a mind is artificially held back because of lack of nutrition, and stunting is a direct result, as we all know, of insufficient nutrients and food during the critical period, as you pointed out, from conception to the 2nd birthday. And this subcommittee and this chairman has made the first 1,000 days one of my highest priorities, because if you get the first 1,000 days right, you get the rest of the life most likely to be far better the immune system is bolstered, and of course, cognitive abilities once lost are very hard to reclaim later on. So it's an early intervention effort that we have been promoting very aggressively as a subcommittee for some time now. And we've actually convened the African Diplomatic Corps recently and heard from 3 ambassadors tell of what they're doing in their respective countries on this effort of global food security, particularly focused on mother and child, so that mothers are healthier and babies, both unborn and newly born into that second birthday, are healthier as well. So if any of you like to expand upon that, because it seems to me the progress that's being made is at risk of being severely reversed, and lives crippled by that lack of food security. Secondly, Mr. Isaac, you mentioned the issue that many of the governments do not have control of these militias, and as you go down the line, the men with guns increasingly report to a warlord or somebody else rather than. My question is, how hard is the governments themselves trying to rein in on that practice? Are they taking a laissez-faire attitude, or are they really trying to say we need a cohesive military unit with a command and control structure that truly, if we say do this, this happens? Because when Greg Simpkins and I spoke to Salva Kiir, we had every indication that they were in control, and that we wonder if that's at all true. When, again, people with guns, even people who had the insignia of his corps, were the ones who were committing atrocities in Tehran. So if you could speak to that. Let me also ask, are we doing enough? I asked this of Mr. Nims earlier. Are we doing enough right now? Are we mobilized sufficiently with enough money to make a difference? Again, as I said earlier, the president and every president since I've been in Congress has made recommendations, some of which were draconian in their cuts. There was a 20% cut envisioned by President Obama on issues like neglected tropical diseases, as well as tuberculosis, an issue that I know members on both sides of the aisle care about very, very deeply. And there are suggestions for some severe cuts, which I don't believe in an instant are going to happen. But there's still reason for concern because they're on the table as something that might happen, so we have to make sure that they don't, especially in light of the crises that we're facing. So is there enough money in the kitty right now? Are we doing enough to really make a difference here? And I have other questions, but let me ask you to respond to those, and then I'll yield to my
I'll start with speaking about the security sector reform in South Sudan. So the South Sudanese, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, were formulated over a lot of different visions that came together. And Dr. John Garang built that into a national vision that ended up being the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the Government of National Unity. And in the end, the South decided to vote, and they went for independence during the referendum. But when you look at the different military units, they were never cohesive around the vision. They were cohesive around the individual leaders. So the building of the SPLA, there was a core contingent of it that, let's say, was in the vision. And then the rest of it was, I made a deal with this person, and they would come in and swear allegiance. So then all the guys that came with that person would put on the uniform. But the allegiance or the command and control capability doesn't necessarily extend down. And as you saw, starting from December of 2013, when the Civil War began, when there's a rupture between relationships at the top, it goes all the way down. But then there can be another rupture down below that and another rupture down below that. So reform in the security sector for South Sudan is something that is desperately needed. The other thing I would like to answer quickly, is there enough resources? I'm not familiar with the details of everybody's budgets, but here's what I do know. About 6 months ago, the World Food Program pretty much across the board reduced everybody's daily rations by 30%. And that wasn't just in South Sudan. It was about 6 months or 8 months ago. Do you remember this? Okay, so I'm not the only one that's experienced this. We haven't talked here, and they're shaking yes, they remember too. But this went not only in South Sudan, it was in Uganda, it was in Iraq, it was in Syria, Turkey, and Greece. Everywhere straight across the board, there was a 30% cut, and I think that's reflective of there are so many displaced people, there are so many refugee people in the world today, And now with this, this drought and other food needs insecurity on top of it, I don't think that there are enough resources. And this is going to breed greater instability, ultimately.
Let me just, your point about the 30% cut. I shared a hearing 2 years ago on why the massive exodus out of the refugee camps run by the UNHCR. And the UNHCR representative said it was the 30% cut.
There you
And
go.
then people had said, they're not going to take care of us. We're voting with our feet, so to speak, and
Yes.
we're just going to leave.
Yeah.
So that, so that's
And,
been an
and
ongoing problem.
I'm not kicking World Food Program there. I'm just saying I don't think that they're being adequately funded. And I also don't think that it's solely the role of the United States. I think by the United States exerting leadership in the humanitarian sector, that means other countries have to come forward. And if I may make one last comment. Mr. Nim said it earlier, but I just want to reemphasize it. Humanitarian aid will never resolve political conflict. And I think that political decision makers in the world today, when they can't get a political resolution, have a tendency to put more pressure on the humanitarian players to get a conflict resolved, and that's never going to work. Political division, political strife requires political resolution. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Just a few comments, Mr. Chairman. I mean, we've talked about men with guns. Often they're boys with guns. But I also want to portray a more positive story of what can be lost as well due to budget cuts and some of our non-emergency food programs funded by USAID, which is integrating these men and boys back into society when they do put their guns down. So a program that we work on in northern Uganda is just that. And in many ways, Uganda, though still going through a lot of challenges, has succeeded in looking at how do you deal with a restive part of your society that's taken up guns for different reasons. So there are positive ways actually you can work on this issue with men with guns. Now, South Sudan is not at that place yet, but clearly when you look at where cuts will be made in peacekeeping, peace-building programs, as it impacts on communities' resiliency, helping young men, helping boys reintegrate into society, put those guns down is part of that food security challenge that we want to get to with them. Because part of the reasons driving them and a lot of recruitment of Boko Haram, frankly, was over economics, not just ideology of an extremist group. But all of these young men, which a report we put out last year proved that point. A lot of them were in debt and they're looking for other financial means just to make their life successful by recruitment in. So some of these programs have to be done in conjunction with other activities, both humanitarian as well as development assistance that works on security and safety. And then finally on the issue, I guess, of is there enough in the kitty? No, because the world has never been in a place where we're at today. 60 million people, refugee or IDP, globally the largest ever since World War II. And now we have basically a food and famine crisis brewing. Now we've been focused inherently over the last few years on what breaks the humanitarian system. Is it simultaneous wars in Yemen, in Syria? Is it a large natural disaster that hits Nepal, et cetera? Well, this is another data point in that kind of terrible story that we're getting to, that without enough resources, and certainly without FY17 rescinded money, people will be without food. So the WFP account was reduced because essentially WFP lends to itself in emergencies. It has its own emergency reserve. So it pulled internally its funding to meet Nigeria, staff up, et cetera. They exceed that amount, and then WFP basically has to start dialing back.
I'd like to briefly respond to the question on nutrition and how some of the existing programs are responding to this. In 2015, September of 2015, I visited a village in northern Kenya, and I was sitting with this grandma who's 82 years old. After a couple of times, a ton of children came to her, and 3 of those were her grandchildren. We had been talking about the challenges in the area, and she explained how the frequency and severity of droughts have been increasing over the years, over the course of her lifetime. One thing that she told me that really struck with me was the fact that she feels so helpless to know that she cannot provide nutritious support to her grandchildren. She was able to raise her children, but today, because of the effects of climate change, rapidly changing and erratic weather patterns, she's simply not able to. So hunger is also an issue that affects people's dignity. And I think as we talk about addressing some of the world's challenges, it really speaks to the issue of our moral obligation and the values that we hold as a human society. Leah came to me and greeted me, and the first thing she said to me, this was an 8-year-old girl, she said, "I feel really dizzy." And by looking at her, I could tell she hadn't eaten for a while. I didn't have to ask her. Because I have seen so many of these every time I visit countries where a number of US programs are working, I get to see communities like this. One of the programs that I really want to expound on a little more is Feed the Future and how it's working to change that around. As we may remember the food price crisis of 2008, riots across 40 countries all over the world. The Arab Spring was largely as a result of the food price crisis, where a lot of people could not afford to buy food. The following year, in 2009, at the G7 summit in L'Aquila, Italy, the US government stepped forward and called upon partners to reverse the decades of neglect in agricultural development. Feed the Future was born out of that initiative. Today, Feed the Future is very serious and keen on turning around the crisis of malnutrition. And the way that Feed the Future works is that it works with governments. It focuses on areas that bring returns on investment. Addressing nutrition is one of those. Like I mentioned earlier, lack of proper nutrition in the critical 1,000 days window destroys people's lives. After that, I visited Senegal, a country that's doing very well on Feed the Future, and the government of Senegal has actually adopted a lot of the tools and is carrying on much of its work on its own. So Feed the Future, a program run by USAID, speaks to the effectiveness of US assistance when they are targeted. But I also want to speak to the fact that we need stronger institutions. We need a USAID that's able to carry out these functions like it's currently doing. Over the last course of about 10 years, we've seen major reforms across the agency. And I think it's very unfortunate that a lot of the stories we hear about this agency being ineffective and wasteful is totally inaccurate. One of the issues I want to highlight is the monitoring and evaluations that are happening currently at USAID. In 2011 alone, since 2011, USAID has conducted more than 1,000 evaluations by independent third parties. 98% of these have been used to shape the agency's policies and programs. Feed the Future is one of those programs. I also want to highlight the Foreign Assistance Dashboard. Out of continued effort from the NGO community, most of whom are represented in this room, have continued to advocate for US foreign assistance to be more effective, return on investment, but also deliver for the people that it serves. And we are seeing a lot of progress on that front. We are seeing more country-led initiatives, governments that are willing to work in partnership with the US government to address their own problems. So I thought I would use the nutrition piece to just highlight the effectiveness of the agency like USAID that would be severely impacted, and we would reverse the decades we've made if these cuts come into effect.
Thank you, Chairman. I think on the story of nutrition, I did mention the 1,000 days in my opening remarks, and I would like to bring this to life with bringing a situation that I came across in the field. When we talk about 1,000 days, we talk about a child we talk about a pregnant mother. That's where we begin. And we talk about a child who's under 2, who's lactating. I meet this mother who is pregnant. She has got a child who's under 2 years of age. And she has a child who's 5 years old. And she's going through a program where we have said we are focusing on the first 1,000 days because our resources are fewer. And she asks me the question, what would you have me prioritize? The child who is in my tummy that I don't see, or this child that I'm lactating, or this child that is crying loud that is here. These are choices that women face every day when programs are not able to meet their needs, but also when really they are not able to provide for themselves. So the first 1,000 days is critical, but it is also a very difficult one for a parent who will be having children of that age group sitting with them. Are we doing enough right now? I would say that the stress migration that we are seeing, or we're beginning to see in Somalia, gives me a sense that we are not doing enough, because otherwise people wouldn't move if we're doing enough. It is important for them to be kept or to stay where they would rather be productive than to move into a camp. That's the last place people want to be. But when you see them moving into that space, it's because they are actually stressed out.
Before yielding to my distinguished colleague, just remind everyone, I think the record should clearly show it, that there has been a strong bipartisan effort on food security. President Bush, beginning in 2002, had the initial foresight to elevate the important role of food security in the U.S. foreign policy, especially in Africa, via the Initiative to End Hunger in Africa, or the IEHA, which was funded through development assistance and implemented through USAID. At the same time, the Millennium Challenge Corporation began making substantial investments in ag-led economic growth programs, particularly in Africa. And as you pointed out, I would say to my friend, that was built upon at the G8 summit meeting in Italy in 2009. I'd like to yield to Ms. Bass.
Thank you. And just adding to that, Feed the Future has definitely been a program that has had bipartisan support, and we actually moved it from just being a program to putting it into statute. So I've seen it myself personally work in the hills of Kenya, and to me, I think it's an example of really how a lot of our foreign aid should be transformed, so that it's not just about us providing direct services, but it's about helping to build the capacity on the ground. So, you know, major support here. And I think along with that, I think Electrify Africa follows in the same vein. You know, Mr. Isaacs, you started by talking about your aid workers. And I don't remember if you said what happened, if they were returned or
They were safely
were
released.
Yeah.
So the SPLA.
Were they South Sudanese?
Yeah, they were all
Originally?
South Sudanese.
Uh-huh.
They were roughed up a little bit, but none of them were killed, none of them were hurt. And, you know, after we did the debriefing, we have like a 6-page report. The blow-by-blow detail is fascinating. So they're kidnapped in a village by a local garrison, whose wife of one of the guys they kidnapped went down and chewed out the garrison guy and said, "What are you doing with my husband? You got to let him go." And he said, "Well, I can't let you and your kids go now because we want to fight those other guys tomorrow. So now you got to stay with us." It's sort of comical, but it could have been tragic and it
Right.
could have been horrific. They were all released safely, and we have gone back. We have talked with the commissioner in the area, and we've even confronted the guy and talked to him. And we're trying to build an environment where there is some kind of stability that we can come back and help people. I mean, it's in the middle of a swamp.
Yeah.
Why would anybody want to come in a swamp and fight?
Well, and I think you raise a real important issue about where South Sudan is these days, that it's not really, you know, a situation of two factions, but many.
It's
And
multiple
so it's fine to say there needs to be a political solution, but I'm not exactly sure what that is or how that comes about. I mean, to me, that's why I always go back to the AU, even though I know the AU has its challenges. But you know, I love what happened in the Gambia as a perfect example, and I wish, you know, obviously that wasn't a situation that had risen to the level of war. But the fact that the countries came together to resolve, you know, a situation is what I certainly hope for. But I don't see how it's just political and not militarily as well. You also mentioned within Uganda that there was a problem. And you mentioned that a percentage of the people were from South Sudan. I was wondering, in terms of hunger, famine, I mean, I don't think that there is famine that is beginning in Uganda, unless you were saying that. And then what percentage of that is because of the refugees versus is Uganda having a problem?
Right. So Uganda is in a level right now that's probably considered stress because the agricultural production and the markets are considered stressed due to lack of rainfall. But with now 800,000 people from South Sudan that have flooded into the area, and the Ugandan government, as Mr. Bowers said earlier, they have a pretty good handle on how to organize that.
Right.
But that's drawing resources out of society. Somewhere it's drawing resources out of the WFP pipeline. And that's more resources that need to be replenished, or it's going to create more insecurity somewhere or another. And there are thousands of people coming every day fleeing
So,
Sudan.
you know, and I'm thinking of the cuts that have been made, and also we're doing a resolution tomorrow in full committee about the famine. But, you know, none of it was going to Uganda. You know, that's not what we're recommending, and I'm just wondering if we shouldn't include Uganda.
So I would say that, I don't know how your budgetary process works, but if you're considering funds to Food for Peace and some of their requests are to help South Sudan refugees, a substantial portion of them are in Uganda now. So however that funding stream runs, but I think that there needs to be consideration made for those refugees to feed them.
And Mr. Bowers, you mentioned Prime in Ethiopia. And it sounds, I mean, I read about it in your testimony. Does Prime exist outside of Ethiopia, or is it just in Ethiopia?
Well, that particular project was designed for arid parts of Ethiopia. So, but I think the construct is what my colleague was saying, because it is a Feed the Future program as well. It's a 5-year program, over 50 million US dollars.
Where are we in the 5 years?
We're at the last year. But that's the proof is there, that we think the evidence is there, and we know the evidence is there to demonstrate that, again, that sort of metric that Matt Nims mentioned today, $1 spent can actually reduce humanitarian needs by over $2.90. So that's a pretty impressive metric. And in an area of the world where we know there will be cycles of drought again, right? So the whole point of resiliency, the whole point of sort of a systems approach is looking at the diverse drivers that make people more resilient so they are not susceptible to us handing out food again.
So what happens, does it need to go on beyond 5 years, or just 5 years?
Well, I think we're always looking for opportunities to continue to build the momentum where the need and the government are both in alignment of, and Ethiopia has shown itself to be quite progressive in championing these type of systems approaches in the region. Kenya is getting there as well. I think it's more difficult to do in areas in Somalia, but not impossible. And then finally, Uganda is another area where we're championing a lot of these multi-year programs that are building resiliency in midst of coping with, as Ken mentioned, 800,000 refugees. So, you know, these are the signature programs that the USG should really be championing, in addition to champion our humanitarian accounts, because those are critical for saving lives.
You know, I do think it's something that we need to lift up in terms of the role African countries have been taking in refugees. We often think of the migration out, but do not acknowledge often that so many refugees are absorbed by other countries, and they do it in principle, which
Right.
I think is something
And I
that-
would just quickly add, the fluidity of that region, obviously, as many people on the subcommittee know, borders there don't really exist in reality, and many of these societies have a cross-border trade, cross-border realities
Yeah, but
that
not for
go
800,000
beyond. So
people.
the markets are all cross-border there, religions, ethnic groups. So the
That's
fact
because the borders were never real.
the
to
borders
begin
are
with.
never supposed to be the, so whatever legislation language you come up with, I think acknowledging that cross-border is very important. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Maposa, you mentioned that that the leaders don't want to call it a crisis, and I'm not sure if you were making reference to, say, for example, there's a problem in Kenya, and it's not really clear whether the Kenyan government is saying that there is a crisis, and I'm thinking also specifically of Nigeria. So how do we help Nigeria if the issue is Boko Haram?
So that was in specific reference to South Sudan.
Oh,
I was
okay.
acknowledging that
I see.
when you see them accepting that there is a famine, they are not crying wolf anymore. In fact, they may be behind the curve, because traditionally for them, they would not want to be the first ones out. You need to push them a little bit more.
I got it. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to credit the ranking member for stealing my favorite question. But I do appreciate the follow-up, Mr. Isaacs, on your 15 aid workers. It leads to, it dovetails with another question. For extraordinarily effective, good organizations represented on the panel, how many members of your organization have you had abducted? How many are still being held? And what can be done to help them? I know it's beyond the purview of the meeting, but I think appropriate in light of the testimony.
So I can say that we have had people kidnapped over the years. I don't know the exact number. We have been blessed not to have too many, and we have none that are
None
held
currently
now.
held.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say for us, we have been fortunate not to have those situations, but the near misses type of situations is where we have had to evacuate staff when we sensed that there was danger.
Sure.
I would just add, I mean, usually we don't comment on these things publicly because some of these cases may be active.
If to the extent that you're not comfortable commenting on it, I'd ask that you reach out to any members of the committee with whom you're familiar and comfortable. Let us know so that we might be able
Sure,
to help.
and we're happy to provide additional sort of international data on that. I mean, most of the abductions currently are in Syria.
Any number of places, and sometimes the government actions might not be classified as abductions, but yeah, let somebody know, and there are members of this committee, Mr. Smith in particular, who've had some wonderful success in sort of humanitarian efforts to help folks out of bad situations, for lack of a more appropriate term. How about Bread for the World? Are you all in the same circumstance where?
No, actually, because we are not a direct service agency, fortunately, we don't have that problem.
I appreciate that, and that's better news than I thought I might hear, so that's very good. Ma'am, you also spoke to the conditions in the refugee camps and how obviously they're breeding grounds for disease and infection, et cetera. Can you also speak to the circumstances as it relates to exposure to extremism, people who are hopeless, and how their circumstances inside these camps might lead them to make decisions they might not otherwise make?
Absolutely. And as I began my remarks, I highlighted this report, which I will just mention again. And the reason I do that is because as we were preparing, putting together this report, we traveled and interviewed lots of people, including young men in Somalia, which is a country that obviously is severely affected. One of the people that presents a story here is a young man called Mohammed. He works with the Global Youth Innovation Network. And this is a group of young Somali men who, in spite of all the challenges around them, have committed to try and prevent recruitment from happening in their own villages. So what Mohammed and his team does is they bring together young men whom they know are prone or susceptible to influence or recruitment by Al-Shabaab, and plan for, a lot of livelihood strategies. They've opened businesses. They've, with support from external partners to a very large scale, though, have helped to build roads and canals, just very impressive initiatives. And this is really to alleviate opportunities where grounds for breeding of such extremists happen.
So at the risk of sounding like my colleague, Mr. Castro, earlier and ending my question with what do you think about that, I would sort of soliloquy, Mr. Chairman, that you very rarely see young people make decisions that relate to transition to extremism where there's an opportunity, where there's hope. And so the work that we're doing here, and I think the bipartisan commitment to ensure that we continue to do it will save lives that we'll never be able to quantify because we'll see fewer people push towards extremism, I think. And I think that, it's hard to do that in numbers, but what you all do, God bless you and thank you. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if this would be an appropriate time. I had spoken to you prior to the meeting about some information that I'd received from the ambassador of the Republic of the Sudan, and he wished to have read into the record. So I'd hand that to you now and ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection, it'll be made part of the record.
If I might articulate very briefly, Mr. Chairman, have had some conversations with leadership from the Republic of the Sudan on semi-related issues. Obviously, the ambassador is not able to testify at this hearing, but they are trying to make it abundantly clear that they hope to become better partners, particularly as it relates to transportation of assets and resources in the South Sudan by virtue of being landlocked, and also that they hope to integrate themselves better into the region and the world moving forward. And I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, for the record, that I've found them to be engaging and well-intentioned, and past activities notwithstanding, I think worthy of sitting down and maybe having some greater discourse with moving forward. And I thank you for your indulgence.
Mr. Garrett, thank you very much, and this submission from the ambassador will be made a part of the record, so thank you so very much for that. I'd like to, Ms. Wabwari, you've referenced that summary of recommendations. To the extent possible, particularly as an executive summary, and some of the recommendations, we'd like to make that a part of the record, so afterwards we'd like to go through it and pull out some of the most important and salient points to make a part of the record.
Thank you.
Mr. Swazi, gentleman from New York.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank each of you for your testimony today and for your great service that you provide to people. Thank you.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Donovan, gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't know how I'm going to get liked more than Tom Swazi right now. That's wonderful. I also got a chance to ask some questions earlier, and I know they're going to call the votes in like 5 minutes. So is there something else that any of you want to tell us, whether it's to understand the issue better, to understand the problems, to understand the solutions? I offer that up to you till the bell rings.
If I may bring up one other thing, all of the localities and the populations that we have talked about today, we have not mentioned two people groups in the southern part of the Republic of Sudan. That's the people in Nuba Mountains and southern Blue Nile. And they have been totally cut off with no humanitarian access since June of 2011. And they continue to be cut off today. And this is a population of a total of about 1.5 million people. So while the words from the Embassy of Sudan are gracious, and I have no doubt that they maybe have made some progress in some areas, there has been no humanitarian access allowed to that, and that is something that I'm very familiar with, and I would ask that you look into that and pressure them to allow access into those areas.
I would add, in the past, we've actually had hearings that focused on the Nuba Mountains almost exclusively because of that lack of humanitarian access. So I think your point is extremely well taken, and I thank you for it. Would anyone else like to add before we close? Any comments? Yes.
I think I'll just close with where I started, that in order for us to make an effective response to one of the world's largest humanitarian crises, we've got to protect funding. We've got to oppose the proposed cuts, and I'm really encouraged, Mr. Chairman, by your confidence that these are going nowhere. That makes me feel a lot more encouraged and motivated, and especially because this is for some of the most vulnerable people around the world. This is not for our organizations. This is for mothers and fathers who watch very helplessly their children die of things that are so solvable, like hunger. And so just very quickly, a robust US government response is needed urgently. We got to act fast because millions of lives are on the brink of starvation. Secondly, please support multilateral assistance, including, World Food Program and the UN Peace Fund, which helps build institutions for peace building over a long period of time. But at the same time, also help to bridge the gap between the humanitarian and the long-term development assistance, because I think that's where we're not making some fast enough progress. And finally, as we respond to the current crisis, let's take that long-term view, so that hopefully in a few years, we're talking about a whole different story and how we've made a difference. And I thank you all very much for the opportunity to testify.
As we close, one of the reasons why we've called this hearing was to hear from the experts who have just absolutely compelling information that needs to be heard by this subcommittee, the Congress, the appropriators, and that's why it was scheduled for today. And also, as we await, a new USAID administrator and other key personnel, because personnel is policy. As you know, Mr. Isaacs, having served, others too as well. The key is having the right person, right persons in those gatekeeper positions, and a lot of that has not happened yet. So we're not flying blind, but we're not don't have the visibility that we should have. So this hearing, and again, your testimonies become very, very, I think, informative and motivating going forward. So I want to thank you very, very strongly for that leadership, because we will take your statements. The full record won't be ready for, it's never done overnight, the Q&A part, but your written testimonies especially, and it'll get very wide distribution, and so I thank you so deeply. The hearing is adjourned.